Hi everyone, I'm Katherine and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. So today I'm going to be talking all about how I made my latest 18th century jacket. This jacket is kind of a remake of my modern 18th century jacket that I made in my video by that same title. I wanted to try it in a new fabric. It's this beautiful silk taffeta fabric, and it actually is the same fabric that I used in a circle skirt. And I wanted to do a remake of it, but this time I wanted to drape the pattern. And if you haven't yet seen the video for how I draped the pattern on my DIY dress form, then definitely check that out. It was a very funny learning experience. So let's just jump into the making of this jacket. Hi everybody, so here's just a quick break. Before we dive into the video, I want to talk to you about my newest online offering, which is my Victorian custom corset making online course. So this course has everything you need to make your very own beautiful historical custom fit corset from start to finish. We cover everything from pattern drafting, mock-ups, choosing a commercial pattern and how to best make that work for your body if you don't want to draft a pattern, how to know what alterations to make in your mock-up and how to actually carry out those alterations to your paper pattern, how to properly cut out your corset panels, accurately sew them together so that it will actually end up being true to your pattern and fitting your body, how to create exterior boning channels, how to work with a Victorian spoon busk and how to beautifully and accurately install it, how to install eyelets, how to bind the tops and bottoms of your corsets, different types of boning and what types of boning I think is best for a beginner to use, how to do beautiful Victorian bone flossing that is both functional and aesthetic. This course covers it all. It has over 4 hours of video instruction walking you through every step of the process. It also has 11,000 words of written material, directions, resources, explanations. It also includes 1 year of complimentary coaching access with me, one-on-one coaching. What this means is that when you are in the midst of your very own corset making project, any issues you encounter along the way, be that with the pattern making, the mock-up, the actual sewing, you will be able to contact me through email or even phone, and we will work together to iron out the issues, and I will bring my expertise into your sewing room and help guide you through the process. So if this sounds like it is for you, I can't wait to have you join me. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the pattern and the mock-up. So as I mentioned, I did drape the pattern for this jacket over my DIY dress form, and the video for that will show you how I used my 18th century stays on the dress form to give her the right shape while I was draping the fabric over it. But of course, draping can only give you a bodice unless you have a dress form with arms, which I don't. So I had to come up with a sleeve pattern. And so what I did was I used the same sleeve pattern from my previous 18th century jacket, which this pattern was modeled after. And I had to basically make sure that that sleeve would fit into this armhole. So I had to do some like cross-referencing and measuring and reducing of the sleeve to fit into this armhole because these armholes are a bit smaller than on that jacket. And about the armholes, this was definitely like a learning experience because I did want to really dive in and try the typical 18th century tight armholes and just making it work because their armholes were set up very differently than ours. So stay tuned to the end of the video to see what I think about the tight armhole situation on this jacket. For the peplum of this jacket, I also used the peplum pattern from my previous 18th century jacket pattern. So check that out if you want a little more background on this. And again, I had to like hold up the paper peplum pattern to the bodice pattern to make sure it would all fit. But of course the peplum is more forgiving because it's pleated up. So you can always just pleat it more or less to make it fit to the bodice. Oh, and I should mention that the pattern for my original 18th century jacket was taken from a Janet Arnold book, and I do have a video specifically about that whole drafting process, and it was kind of a fiasco. So if you're interested in grading up patterns, Janet Arnold, definitely check out that video. So after I had my pattern, I did make a mock-up out of cotton muslin, and this was probably one of the best mock-ups I've ever made. And I think it's because I did drape the pattern on my DIY dress form, which is my same body measurements. So that right there takes a lot of guesswork out of the process. Okay everybody, so here's the finished mock-up for the 18th century bodice that I just draped. I think it fits quite well, all things considered. For most of the mock-ups I've made, this is probably one of the better ones. So you can see I just did one sleeve and then one half of the peplum. And for the peplum, I ended up using the exact same peplum pattern from my previous 18th century jacket video. And I just made some alterations to it based on my last experience with it, because I'd had some issues with the bottom line being a bit weird. So I just corrected some of that, and I think it looks quite good with this jacket. There's a couple fit issues with this though, is I feel like the sleeve needs some work. Possibly a bit shorter, because I think this curve is supposed to be right at my elbow. I might shorten it a little bit so this curve in the sleeve is sitting right over my elbow, so that makes it, has to be about an inch or so higher. And then the bust feels a bit tight, so I feel like I need to figure out how to do like a full bust adjustment on an 18th century bodice. I don't know how to do that. But if anything, the waist is a little loose. So I need to do some kind of adjustment. I'm thinking I will slash the pattern open at the side, add more width at the bust area, and then remove a little width at the waist area. There was no neck hole gaping that I had to deal with because, again, I just draped the neck hole right on the dress form, so I knew there would be no gaping. There was also no vertical height issues. I have a longer torso, and usually when I alter patterns, I have to make them longer. But again, I didn't have this issue. So the mock-up is really pretty good. There weren't that many adjustments I had to make to it. Okay, so now let's talk about cutting out the pattern. This jacket has a lot of components, and I was really pleasantly surprised at how my cutting, planning, and sewing skills have improved since when I first started doing all this, because in the past, cutting out all the pattern pieces for a jacket like this would have gotten me so overwhelmed, and I wouldn't have known where to begin, and I probably would have cut a lot of corners. Because in this jacket, there is the outer silk taffeta layer. There's also the lining, which is made of cotton muslin. And then there's interfacing pieces, which I also cut out of the exact same cotton muslin. And then as an extra touch that I decided to add, which again, I probably wouldn't have done this in the past, was adding facings all around the neckline. And what that means is that when I'm wearing my jacket, you kind of catch a glimpse of the inside area of the neckline. It's the matching fabric. It's not just that cotton muslin going right up to the top. There's a band of the matching fabric around the neckline. Again, this is something that always overwhelmed me, the thought of adding in facings to a lining, but it was a lot easier than I expected, I think, just from all the practice I've been getting from making all these projects over the past couple of years. I also want to mention that I was too lazy to add seam allowances to my pattern pieces, so I just traced them out onto the fabric and then mostly added it by eye. So I added a 1 centimeter seam allowance to the bodice pieces. But this ended up being a little bit weird because the sleeve pieces that I was using from my previous pattern already had a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance built in. So I definitely wouldn't recommend working like this because it's easy to make errors when you're sewing if you forget that there's different seam allowances. But I think it turned out all right. I pretty much remembered it the whole time. Oh, and about the cutting out, I also want to mention about the stripes and the direction of the stripes. I did try to do some pattern matching when I was cutting out. So I opted to have vertical stripes on the bodice and the peplum, but the stripes going horizontally across my arm. I'm not quite sure how I feel about this. Sometimes I think it would have looked better with vertical stripes on the sleeve as well, but I still think it turned out all right. When I was cutting out the peplum, usually the peplum would just have 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. But I wanted to have more control over the direction of the stripes because this peplum is shaped like a circle skirt. So if I just cut it out in one big piece, the stripes would be going in different directions depending on what part of the peplum we were talking about. So I split each peplum piece into 2 pieces. So I ended up with 8 peplum pieces. But I only did that for the outer layer of striped fabric. For the lining, I just kept it the way it was because it's just cotton muslin. Okay, now let's talk about sewing the bodice of this jacket. The great thing about sewing a garment that's going to be fully lined is that you don't have to worry about finishing the raw edges of the seam. You literally just sew the seam and press it and you're done. Now, of course, that could be canceled out by the fact that you have to sew essentially the same garment twice to get the lining, but I like lined garments. I just feel like they are so much more luxurious and long-lasting and tough wearing. So I think it's definitely worth adding a lining, especially to a jacket. I mean, jackets should have a lining, of course. So I went ahead and stitched my bodice seams together. So there was a front piece that kind of extended over past where a modern side seam would be into the back area. And then there was one back piece. This back piece was supposed to be split into 2 pieces, but it just worked out where I didn't have to do it like that. So for making the bodice, I went ahead and stitched my bodice seams together with my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and then I went ahead and pressed them. I also trimmed and clipped them to help them lay flat depending on what area of the seam and if it was curved or not. When it came to the sew-in interfacing, I opted to just sew my pieces of interfacing only to the lining, and I did this by machine to save time, but because I wasn't stitching the sew-in interfacing directly to the outer silk layer, I wasn't worried about stitching lines being visible. So that was really nice, because in my first jacket video, I cut my interfacing. I wasn't really thinking fully, and I thought it would be a good idea to just cut off the seam allowances so it wouldn't add bulk to the seams. But the problem with that is that then you basically have to sew it in by hand because it's not going to be caught in the seams. So you have to do all sorts of extra stitching. So this time I just left the seam allowances in place. Then I sewed together the lining of the bodice in the exact same way as I'd sewn together the silk layer, just pinning them together, stitching them, and then pressing and clipping the seams where necessary. Now, in terms of adding the silk facings to the lining, in theory, usually when you're adding a facing to a lining, you'll actually trim away the lining in the area where the facing is going to go so you don't end up with too much fabric in that area. But as I was sewing it together, I just realized I didn't want to do that because my fabrics that I was dealing with weren't especially thick to begin with, and I thought it might be nice to have the extra layer of fabric reinforcing the neckline. So I just went ahead and stitched the facings in place over top of the neckline area of the lining. Now, in all of the seams where there was like interfacing and facings involved in the seam, they were pretty bulky, so I definitely trimmed these down as much as I could, and I did something called seam grading, or grading the seam allowance, which is where you'll trim one layer of the seam allowance shorter than the other layer, so that way you don't end up with a very obvious ridge where all the edges end. You kind of have one edge ending here, another edge ending here, so it makes it a little more streamlined. So I also stitched boning channels into the center back because this was something that I remembered from my previous 18th century jacket, which is that there was some boning channels reinforcing the center back area. So I just used some woven fabric tape that I stitched down over the center back area of the lining. So let's talk about the center front closure for this jacket at this point. So after all of my fun experiences with making skirt plackets and using sew-in snaps and the fun of making an invisible closure like that, I just figured I would do a similar thing with this jacket, that I would have a placket with a sew-on snaps, and they would just come together and you'd only see like a center front closure just like this, and you wouldn't see anything that's on the inside. So I did originally cut my pattern with enough fabric for a placket, but I don't know what happened along the process, but somehow I lost the fabric that I needed on the lining. The outer layer was still fine, but somehow the lining, the placket got cut off somehow. I don't remember what happened. So after I finished sewing the lining, it was at this point that I realized that I was missing the fabric needed to make a placket. So I quickly had to rethink my plans. So I decided I would try something authentically 18th century, and that is having a hidden lacing closure at the center front. So basically the outer layer is not connected to the lining at the center front, and you have these eyelets that are just going through the lining, and then you lace it up and the lacing doesn't show from the front. I've always really liked the idea of this, but for some reason I just never tried it yet, so I decided this was a good time. So I went ahead and marked the placement of where my eyelets would need to be, and then I had to figure out how I would finish the edges of the fabric, because I had to finish the outer layer and the inner layer independently of each other. So I just added facings to both of these layers and that helped reinforce the edge as well. Then I went ahead and I set my eyelets. I used metal eyelets for this. I didn't do the sew in eyelets because this was just a spur of the moment thing and I didn't want to take the extra time to do sewing eyelets, so I just did my metal ones. I like to set my eyelets using an industrial hammer eyelet setting kit that I bought from Farthingale's corset-making supply, and I do this on my basement workbench on top of a little anvil. So it was at this point, after I added the eyelets, that I kind of decided it would be a cool idea to have enough inherent structure in the jacket itself that I wouldn't have to wear it over stays for it to give the proper shape. Kind of like 18th century jumps. There's some types of jumps that gave like some of the support that a pair of stays would, but it was worn as outerwear and it sort of replaced the need for stays. And that's what I wanted to do with this jacket. So before I got the outer layer connected to the inner layer, I decided I should go ahead and add some extra boning channels to make that possible. So again, I used my fabric woven tape and I just sewed it in the areas that I would need extra reinforcement. So I did decide to add some boning at the center front because of the eyelets, and then I also added a strip of boning right here and at the side seam. Okay, so now let's talk about making the sleeves and cuffs for this jacket. The sleeves and cuffs are really my favorite part of this jacket, or one of my favorite parts. And 18th century sleeves, let's just talk about that for a minute, because they are really miracles of engineering. First of all, they were set into this very small armhole, which, contrary to popular belief that this impeded women's range of motion, it actually didn't at all. You could actually argue that it increased their range of motion because it means that the fabric of the bodice goes up higher, whereas if the armhole was bigger, every time you lifted up your arm, it would kind of pull the bodice up with it and you wouldn't be able to lift your arm fully for fear of ripping the bodice. Whereas when the armhole is tighter, you have more fabric from the bodice to work with. So look, I can move my arms perfectly, no issues whatsoever. I'm a busy mom of 4 and this hasn't impeded things whatsoever. But for more of my thoughts on how these specific armholes turned out, just stay tuned for the very last section. Part of the factors that made 18th century sleeves possible to work in such a small armhole is that they were curved. So they had some curve built into the sleeve to allow for the natural bending of the arm at the elbow. So if you look at the sleeve panels, there is 2 panels. There's a top panel and then an under panel, and they come together over the elbow area. And at the seam where it's over the elbow area, both of those panels kind of curve so that when they come together, it's going to build a curve into the very bottom of the sleeve where your elbow is. So it's really pretty smart. When it comes to the cuffs, these cuffs are called winged cuffs. They are definitely a specific like kind of fashion trend that was not all through the 18th century. It was at a specific point in the 18th century. I can't think of when it was off the top of my head. But I really like these cuffs. Now, when I first made my 18th century jacket last year, I was pregnant at the time, and this was definitely an experiment for me at that time. I was very nervous about making winged cuffs because I thought it would just look over the top. But in the end, the winged cuffs were the part of the jacket that made me love it the most, because especially having a big belly, I found that the winged cuffs helped offset visually some of the sides of my belly. Like if you looked at me from the side, you know, I had a big belly, but I had these winged cuffs in the back. So it kind of helped balance the overall view of my figure. And ever since then, I've always loved winged cuffs because I just think they add so much visual interest and they help balance out the figure and just draw the eye more to other areas of the garment than just the top area or your face or whatever. So basically I had 4 sleeves that I had to sew. I had the 2 outer sleeves as well as the 2 lining sleeves. So I went ahead and sewed all those seams, because again, there's 2 panels in each sleeve. And I pressed these seams over a seam roll before clipping them down, especially in the curved area of the seam. I then stitched the lining sleeve to the bodice lining and the outer sleeve to the outer bodice. This is something I did differently than the first time I made this jacket, because that time I sewed both pairs of sleeves just to one of the bodices, and then I ended up turning under the inner edge and just stitching it by hand. But this time I wanted to try something different, and I like this method better. So to make the cuffs, I first had to sew on my sew-in interfacing to the lining layer of the cuffs because they are fully lined as well, and they're fully interfaced. And then I sewed both the side seams of the cuff. So there's a very long curved side seam and then there's a short side seam for the inside of the cuff. And of course, pressed these, clipped the curved seam, and then I attached the outer layer of the cuff to the inner layer by just sewing right sides together along one of the edges and then turning it right side out, pressing the edges of the final seam under, and then doing a top stitch by machine. About making the peplum now. So the peplum is definitely competing in my mind with the sleeve cuffs for being my favorite part of the jacket. I love the peplum. I absolutely love the look of an 18th century flared out peplum. Like, just look at it. Let's show this peplum. Look at how much interest it adds to the figure, and it automatically helps create an hourglass figure because it flares out over your hips. And I just love the look of it. So something I learned from my first jacket making adventure was that when the peplum is all pleated up, the bottom edge might not be trued up. It might not be straight over the area where the pleats are. And the first time I made this jacket, I made the mistake of finishing the edge all perfectly and nicely and then pleating it up and realizing that it stuck out. It formed these like ducktails over the area where the pleats were because it wasn't trued up. So I ended up having to cut off my nice finished edge, true up the edge of the peplum, and then refinish it by hand. So this time I pinned the peplum carefully over my dress form, pleated it up the way it would be, and made sure that the edges were all trued up and trimmed it where necessary. And then I finished the bottom edge of the peplum. Now before doing this, obviously I'd sewn the side seams of the peplum. And again, the peplum is fully lined and fully interfaced. So I first sewed my sew-in interfacing to the lining layer, sewed my side seams, and then I had a lining peplum and an outer peplum, which after testing out the bottom edge, like I mentioned, I sewed right sides together along the bottom edge of the peplum and turned it right side out and pressed it. And finally, I added a nice top stitch just to hold it nice and flat at the bottom. Finally, I formed the pleats in the peplum area, so they're mostly around the hips. And I obviously did some cross-referencing between the peplum and the bodice just to make sure that they would fit each other. Okay, so finally let's talk about attaching the lining to the bodice. So we have a finished bodice with sleeves attached, and we have a finished lining with sleeves attached, and then we have a separate peplum and separate cuffs. So how did I bring all this together into the final jacket? Well, once I had my eyelets all added and my center front edges finished, again, independently of each other, I went ahead and I sewed the neckline seam, connecting the outer layer of fabric to the lining layer. And of course I did this right sides together. I pressed it and then I understitched. So understitching, if you're not aware, is a process where you have the seam open and exposed and you sew the seam allowance just to the lining, very, very close to the original seam. And this just helps it lay flat without having obvious top stitching. So this is a really nice thing to do to a neckline where you don't want to have obvious top stitching usually. Now, in order to connect the sleeve ends to each other, I simply just sewed a rolled hem in the bottom of the sleeves. And then I did my best to stitch in the ditch of the armhole seam. Ideally, this might be something you want to do in all of the seams, but I just didn't feel like doing that, and I felt like it would look too apparent. I didn't want to have all sorts of obvious stitching over the bodice, so I just did it over the armholes. And of course, this is something you could do by hand, but in this project, I really just felt like doing most of it by machine. So then it was time to connect the cuffs to the bottom of the sleeves. So I did attempt to do this by machine, and I did manage to get some of it attached by machine, just like this area right here, but it ended up being very tricky to get it on machine without accidentally sewing through the underside of the sleeve. So I ended up also adding some hand stitches to hold more of the cuff in place along the sleeve. Now, because these are winged cuffs and they extend past the actual arm, obviously they're not connected all the way around, just like a little more than halfway around the sleeve. Okay, so this jacket was finished. How do I like it? I absolutely love this jacket. It definitely did succeed at being able to give an 18th century shape without stays underneath, which I'm really happy about. Now I am wearing stays under it right now, and I was wearing stays underneath when I took the photos just because I wanted to try it with the actual stays. But it's really good to know that I don't need to wear stays under this jacket, and because of the extra boning channels I added, it does give an 18th century silhouette all in its own, which is really cool. I absolutely love the hidden front lacing of this jacket. It feels like the first more authentic 18th century garment that I've made, apart from the fact that the eyelets are metal, of course, but on my other 18th century jacket, I didn't do a period accurate closure type. I did hooks and eyes. So this time I did the hidden lacing, and I really love it, just how it's the secret type of lacing, because the thing that's always turned me off of adding lacing into my jackets is that this is something I'm going to be wearing day to day, and I kind of have a phobia of visible lacing because I feel like that automatically, in many people's minds, kind of turns it into a costume. Now, I'm probably going to try lacing at some point because my feelings of that are evolving. I think lacing would be kind of cool, but I really do like the hidden lacing. Something I also like about the lacing is that the first time I tried it on, I had it lacing starting at the top and going down to the bottom, but my son, who is nursing, made me change my mind on that. Basically, I decided it's a good idea to have that lacing from the bottom to the top, so that way during the day when I have to nurse my son, I can just lightly loosen up the lacing at the very top to access things. Okay, now let's talk a bit about the armholes because I promised I'd talk about that. So like I said, 18th century garments did mostly have tight armholes. I shouldn't say mostly. They all had tight armholes. Men's and women's garments both did. And I really wanted to capture that in this jacket, and you can see how small and tight these armholes are. But I feel like I need to do a little more research and just testing out of how this would work, because I do feel a bit of constriction just at the front here. I kind of feel like the seam is biting into me a little bit. So I don't know, I feel like I need to change it a little bit. I'll have to experiment in the future. But yeah, I'm really happy with how this jacket turned out, especially with the fabric I used. This fabric has really been the gift that keeps on giving. It started out making my circle skirt, and then I made a pair of shoes out of it, and now I've made an 18th century jacket from it. So I really, really love it. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like. Leave your comments and questions below. Let me know what you think of this jacket, if you've ever made anything similar, or if you want to make anything similar. All my social media links are in the description. Oh, as well as the accompanying blog post for this video where I'll go into full-blown written details of the making process. So if you're interested in making something similar or learning more about 18th century garment construction, then definitely check that out. Okay guys, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye!